Well, it's another. It's another what? I don't know what I'm saying there. Yeah, we're 3 streams in. I was so cocky. Like, yeah, the 3rd stream's going to be the last. I think it might be the last one this time. No, it's not. It's never going to be the last one. I'm talking about Ratchet and Clank, of course. We're 3 streams in to the 3rd game. We're right at the end. We're trying to beat that final boss. It's like when you're like, oh, you stayed up all night late trying to like beat it, you know, and then you got school the next morning. You get up and you're like, oh, you just want to get home and just beat that final boss. You know, that certain part of the game, and you're like, oh, you're like, nah, I haven't got homework, mum. Nah, I just got to beat that thing first. You got to knock it out, get it out the way, and you're like, yeah, finally, I've done. You know. One of the advantages of being an only child as well was like that you had plenty of time, like with, you know, if you had video game consoles or anything like that, you had plenty of time with them. And like I remember having friends. I remember like one time there was like a great example of like I had these friends who were it was like 3 brothers, and I was mainly friends with the oldest and middle brother, and because they were the ones that I kind of directly went to school with. The youngest one was like 2 or 3 years younger, so he was never at the same school at the same time. I'd just see him when I went round to their house, and like they owned like some video games that I owned as well. One of them being Star Wars Galactic Battlegrounds, and I remember them getting shitty with me, or not them, like one of them, like the oldest brother, because he was like in denial that like I had somehow been able to clock, like, you know, finish the campaigns of Star Wars Galactic Battlegrounds before him. And it's like, yeah, mate, like the thing is, you got to realise, like, as soon as I come home, that's all I do, is I just play that, whatever that current video game that I've got is. And I like even said that, it's like, that's all I do when I go home, is I just play that game, and I get to play it for like hours and hours. And it's only me on the computer. Whereas he would have to share the computer with him, his 2 brothers, and his 2 parents, because his 2 parents were also like gamers who would like want to play that game and other games as well. So it's like, there's 5 people who are actively wanting to play on that computer. Not just, oh, they all use it, but mum just uses it for emails or something or whatever, you know, and then, oh, the other one, dad barely goes on it, or he might play games occasionally. They all actively played on it. And just you know, it was always found it quite funny that like he just got shitty, would be like, not like, it wasn't some permanent end of the friendship thing or nothing at all. It was just like, you know, that was a day or 2 or something where he was like that. Where he's just in denial that like I complete it. It's like, mate, there's no point in me like, I can't remember if he said anything about using cheat codes or something. I don't remember him actively trying to accuse me of cheating. But he was just like, I think he was just trying, I think he had sort of might have scrolled through that possibility, but he didn't try and make some great claim about that. It was just like, oh, you must have cheated or something. It's like, there's no point in me cheating, especially the fact that like you can't see my computer at home, so there's no point to prove and say like, it's not like I can go, look, here's the completed product, here's the game finished or something. Like, there was no way, like, if that was the case, I could just go to school and just say, yeah, I clocked it. And then it's sitting there at home unfinished. You know, like, I don't actually need to cheat through it and then be like, yeah, I've clocked it. It's like, why would I do that? Like, that serves me no purpose. And I wasn't like, I'm not that person at all. And like, literally just the one time he's just like, yeah, just like, you know, nah, you know, like, you couldn't have done it that quickly. But like, got real irate and like upset, but like, no, you couldn't have done it. It's like, because we both love Star Wars, and Star Wars Galactic Battlegrounds was quite a fun game. It was basically just Age of Empires 2 with like a how do you put it, a Star Wars skin over it, you know, because effectively it seemed to be like the same game engine, it just had Star Wars trappings over it. But it was a really fun game, and both of us had spent like, ultimately would spend like a lot of time playing that game, you know, like again and again and stuff, like skirmishes and the campaigns and all that stuff. But when we first got it, it was like, oh no, you couldn't have clocked it yet. And it's like, I literally, mate, all I did was literally sit there at night after night, just jamming through those campaigns. That's all I did. Like, me on my own on the computer. Like, there's no one else because they would all try and do it separately as well. So it wasn't like they were even all, because you'd have to go through one campaign like at a time. It wasn't like you got access to all of the campaigns, like the Rebel campaign and the Imperial campaign and the Naboo like all the different civilizations that you could play as in that game. It wasn't like you could play as all their story campaigns, like, pick which one you wanted to dive into from the start. You had to go through, there was a random order that they kind of got unlocked in. And so I worked my way through those. And so they were all separately, the people in that house, all trying to do it. Because I remember when I'd go around to their house, they'd have all the different profiles of like, oh yeah, David's that far through, Matthew's that far through. You know what I mean? Like they would do this for every game. So they're all, because you want to enjoy that experience and play through it yourself and that. So they would all, have their own account or whatever you want to call it, profile of their progress through any game. And so I can remember seeing their progress on that game. And they all had their own active, separate things. Which is all good and all, because you don't want to be like playing one campaign and then the next time you go back and play it, oh shit, like the current campaign that they're up to now is a different thing. You don't want to be continuing on from someone else's game. You want to be playing it yourself, So they're all separately trying to play it on the little allotments of time that they have versus me with my own, plenty of time to do so. And it was just quite funny, but we're also like what I would have been like, how old would I have been when I started there? When I've at that school, because there's a school in New Zealand. There's a type of school in New Zealand called intermediate, which is like the between. I guess the name might allude to it. Intermediate. It's like a between school, and so in New Zealand you have primary school, intermediate, and then high school / college. Because in New Zealand, high school and college are the same thing, and then in America, what they call college, that's university. And so at intermediate though is where I met this family of these three brothers. Or the first year this kid that was in the same year as me was the oldest brother, and then when we got to the second year of intermediate, the middle brother, who was a year behind, he wasn't behind, he was struggling or something, just he was a year younger than us. He was in the first year. And so I think in that first year of intermediate though was when we got Star Wars Galactic Battlegrounds. And that was I think that was the year. It was 2000. I think that was the year. It was 2001. It was definitely when I was at intermediate, because I still knew these kids. We went to the same high school together, and we hung out there as well. But it was at intermediate where we got Star Wars Galactic Battlegrounds, and we I think it was, and I swear it was the first year. And so this kid David, he was just so in denial of that. You could have done it, and it was just like, David, I've literally got all the time in the world. But anyway, at intermediate, it was I would have been 12 or something, was what I'm getting at. I think when I started there, because I would have turned 11 in 2000, and I would have turned 12. I would have turned 11 in the year 2000, and I would have turned 12 in the year 2001. So I would have been 11 when I started there, and then turned 12. And then in the second year, I would have been 12 and turned 13. Okay. So I would have been around 12 kind of thing. So he would have been the same age. So we're just young kids when he's saying this as well about oh, I don't believe you, da-di-da. So it's not like an adult saying to another adult. We're adults can act like idiots as well. But it's not like he was a grown man, and it's well, you're being a bit childish, mate. It's we were kids, But the idea of, it was just randomly funny how I would play all these other games in there. And I think it was also one of the times where we'd most directly kind of had been playing through the same game at the same time, the progress, where we're most aware of hey, we're both trying to progress through this game, the story of it, the campaigns in this case. And so it was just funny, and especially because it was Star Wars, it's no, Star Wars is my thing, I think in his head, and he's no, Star Wars is my thing, I like Star Wars more, one of those insecure little nerd things. And it's just funny, just shut up, David, it's just a game, mate. Settle down. But it's just funny. Couldn't believe it. There had to be some reason for either you're lying and you haven't gotten through it, or you're cheating or something. There's no way. And he never had any reasoning either. It's anytime someone's point is always sort of generally, full of it, is when they're, they don't really have any reasoning. I remember when I moved from one part of Australia to the part that I live in now, and they were like, oh, you don't want to, like, I live in the city of Perth, which is in Western Australia. It's like they call it the capital city because each state has its own capital city. But obviously Sydney is not Sydney. What am I going to? That's a mistake. Canberra is the capital city of Australia, the country. But then each state has its own capital, and Perth's where I live, which is the capital of Western Australia. But really, it's the only big city, and most states in Australia only tend to have one big city anyway. So it's not like they have a choice to pick from of like, oh, there was like multiple cities that could have been that, and that's the one. So yeah, when I moved to Perth, people will be like, oh, you don't want to move to Perth. Perth's a hole, like da-dee down. It's like, why? Why don't want to move there? Oh, because. And it's like, why though? Like, and I'd always ask for a reason. A lot of people, I had a bunch of people say it, like living where I was, because I was in a tourist town, so it's all people just zonking out and just avoiding reality basically. Just either going there temporarily to have a good time, or they're just like trying to live there permanently, avoiding wherever they've moved away from in Australia, and they're just Perth, they don't want to go there, it's a hole. It's like, but why? And it's like, it's just because it's like they don't have any reason, and I'd say that about a lot of other places in Australia as well. And it's just realised that they don't really have an argument. They just sort of want to get that across, and it's like, but they don't really. It's all emotional, because it's some personal thing happened in there, and it's really nothing to do with the place. It's just their personal history of that place. Like they can't actually name reason, like details as to why, and it was like that was David with Star Wars Galactic Battlegrounds in terms of me, where he was just like, oh, well, why don't you think that I've passed it yet? Oh, I don't know, just you might have done that or that, I don't know, It's just funny, like kids, how kids can get. But it was the only game he ever got like that with as well. Because we played a bunch of other games, but I think it was the one where also kind of the most active in terms of we bought it kind of right at the same time, and would be talking about the the progress of that or whatever. But he never had any problem because we'd come to school and it wasn't like I bet it in like a night or two, but it was in the space of like a week and a half, something like that I clocked it. Like went through all these campaigns because I just played it night after night, and I had hours and hours each night to do it. And it's only like 5 or 6 campaigns. Each campaign's 5 or 6 levels or something, So within the space of a week and a half, I'd clocked it out. I'd hammered it out, and it wasn't like I was playing on it because I swear there was even like an easy, medium, hard difficulty. There was something like that to it as well. And I wasn't playing it on easy, but I wasn't playing it on hard, and it wasn't like he was playing it on hard that I remember. So it was, it just was what it was, and I just had more time to allocate to it. And so, like, far more time than any of them, because they're all, as I say, 5 people sharing one computer. And just, yeah, it's quite funny how, the denial of it. But that's the fun, some of the funny times, like I remember, like as a child, like not just playing video games, but then even just, like the sort of, it's something that people, I feel like first register. It's funny enough with Star Wars, where people would, like with pop culture, where people would get this ownership, or like fan ownership over pop culture, certain elements of what they think, like that's my thing, that's my, like mine, my, like Gollum, like that's mine, my own, my precious. And I understand it to a certain degree, but it's always quite funny when it's, I always find it quite funny when it's something that's so, I understand that fan ownership thing to a certain degree, I say, because there's a big asterisk or whatever you call it, one of those little star things next to it, like, because when it's something that no one else is into around you, within your social circle, or even people that, just outside of you, that you sort of, no one else that you ever seem to encounter is like, into this, thing, I can understand it, because it's like, it's only me that seems to be into it. And that there's obviously other people into this because this thing's successful, whether it's a band or a, just a singular musician, or it's a video game series or a movie series, something or other, a book series, some piece of pop culture or whatever that, some medium of storytelling or something or other, that no one else around you is into, and it seems like you're the singular person that is. I can understand getting a sense of like fan ownership and away from that. Then when you do meet someone else who is finally into it, and you're like, oh, you're a fan of that, are you? And you sort of test each other on like knowledge of like, are you really a fan of it? Or you know about, oh yeah, with the second album, or what about that game? You know, whatever you think, that movie or something. You know, you start quizzing each other. But when it's something like Star Wars, which is about as universal as like water, you know, in terms of like, you know what I mean? Like for like, in terms of pop culture, like any sort of quote unquote nerd, you know, like anyone who's like fan of movies or, you know, storytelling or just, you know, there's a lot of things that just on a certain base level of just enjoying like entertainment that, you know, people could be and will be into Star Wars to some degree, and it might just be in a casual way of like, oh yeah, I like the movies, they're fun to watch, you know, and they just enjoy watching a good fun movie, and that can apply to a lot of different movies, and they're just like, yeah, and Star Wars ticks that box. It's just a good fun movie. They're all good fun movies to watch and just sit down and whatever, you know. Or you're like some dedicated person who's like, you know, like, oh no, I really know all about the mythology and all the different characters and love reading up about it, and that's cool, awesome, you know. But when you're like one of those people who's like tries to act like you got fan ownership over it, and it's like, it is this quite universal thing that's out there, like everyone sort of is aware of it, and like I've been into things in the past, like game series and things that like a lot of people wouldn't even know about, or if they even have heard of it, they're like, no, I've never played it, never whatever bought one of them or played it or anything or something. But even a lot of people wouldn't even know of it, and one of those things was Final Fantasy. Like as a kid, because I'm born in 89, so a lot of my sort of childhood of Final Fantasy is those PlayStation 1 era Final Fantasy games, and then moving into like the PlayStation 2 era. You know, like, so Final Fantasy 7, 8, 9 and 10 are like a huge piece of like my childhood. 7, 9 and 10 especially, because I think like, and then I'd even whittle it down to like, you know, because 7, and that's where I would get like, you know, but not like, I think I'd always be a little bit more understanding of just that I am this sort of fan of it and like really dig it and love it, and that, and maybe I have a bit of fan ownership going on, but I'm self-aware about it, whereas people like my friend David, I don't think were as self-aware of sort of how they sit within the fandom, you know. And it's like, you can be that, but just be self-aware, you know, and then you can still love it and read up all about the stuff, but you lose the sort of fanaticism, you know, like the sort of in terms of your social interaction with other people, you don't sort of autistic out around other people, you know, in that way, because you're you know, you're just at least self-aware of like, oh, I really like this thing and I know a lot about this thing, but not everyone's going to be like me, you know. And so yeah, like it was just very, how do I put it, like something like Final Fantasy was something that no one I ever encountered was really into it, and then it was finally a kid that I met who was really into it, and he seemed to be like play it more than me and have gotten further through some of the games more than me, but I didn't get insecure or sort of hate him about it. I actually sort of like enjoyed it, like, wow, finally someone who likes it, and like I can learn from what do they know about it or something that I don't, and let's see how far ahead they've gotten and what they know about it, and you know, just enjoy that they enjoy it, you know. And yeah, like it, that was sort of a thing where I can at least understand, you know, where you can have where that can at least emanate, you know, when it does come around. It's like, well, it's a bit logical when it's I feel like it's a bit more logical that they could, not that it's right or wrong, getting a, you know, but even still, I feel like when I would then socially interact with people on that subject, it was like, okay, like I understand, I'm really into this thing and no one else really does, you know, seems to be into it, but you know, that just is what that is, you know. It's not, it doesn't mean that I own it or anything, or that, you know, I have a right to it that other people don't, which is, I think, like sort of what some people like, you know, David with Star Wars, it veers into a little bit. And then the irony that when they get that way with something so public, you know, something so universal or whatever, like Star Wars, it's like, really? Like, I could at least understand if you get that way with something particularly niche and you've never known anyone who else who's into it and you feel like you're the gatekeeper of it. That's a little bit what it is, a little bit of gatekeeping. And it's not like he's trying to deny me from Star Wars, essentially, but it's just like, oh, you couldn't have beaten the Star Wars thing before me. I've got to be the best. I've got to do the Star Wars thing first. because there wouldn't have been any problem with him doing beating the Star Wars thing first. It was the fact that I beat the Star Wars thing before him. That's where the problem was. So, yeah. Like when I met someone who was into Final Fantasy games as well, finally, and then they had gotten further than me, I didn't get all upset about it. Oh, you must have cheated. You must have cheated or done this. It's like, no. They've just maybe been playing it a bit longer than me, and or have sort of maybe thinking a bit better when they've played it or something, like whatever reasoning, they're just better at playing, because it's not an easy game to really cheat in. Like, you can't just punch cheat codes in. But even so, I knew he wasn't cheating, this kid. It's just, he's just done better at it than me, or whatever. He's played it for longer or whatever, and da-da-da-da. Because I also didn't own all of them. I owned, like, I think one of them. But when I met him, I only tended to own more, like, I think one of them, and then he owned about 4 of them, and the other 3 that he owned that I, so out of the 4, 7, 8, 9, and 10 at the time, I think that I met this kid, I think he owned 7, 8, and 9, and I think he got 10 right around the time I met him, and then because he didn't have a PS2 when I first met him, and 10 was the first one that was on PS2. But he got a PS2 a little while after, not too long after I met him, and then he had Final Fantasy X as well. So he had 4 of the games, and I think actually he had more. He had, like, I think 5 of them, because he had, like, Final Fantasy Anthology or something, which I think was actually like 2 Final Fantasy games, like 5 and 6. He had something like that as well. So he actually probably had about probably 5 or 6 Final Fantasy games in total. But out of, like, the sort of the 4 that he had that I had played, like, I think even that, not 4, like, there was about, out of the 5 or 6 that he had, there was about 3 that I had played, and one of those 3 I owned, But I really liked that series, but he owned more of them than me. He had played them, like, it was almost like the only thing he would play was Final Fantasy. Like, he didn't really seem to play any other games at all. He only played Final Fantasy games. But you didn't see me getting upset about it, So it's interesting how people, sort of claim this ownership over, pop culture and different storytelling mediums, or just stuff, Just it's funny. Because there's always going to be someone out there better than you at something, generally, Even Chris Kyle, the American Sniper, was he like the best sniper ever? Like, when he was alive, he was probably one of the best or something, maybe at his time, but he might not even have been the best at that time, but he's one of the best, But he might have been the best in a combat environment at that time, So there's always probably someone out there better if, you put them all, lay them down and on the shooting range and test everyone out. That can even be a metaphorical thing of a shooting range. You put everyone down in front of Star Wars Galactic Battlegrounds or something, and whatever, and you're, oh, hang on, there was that person over there who really, da-de-da, but they actually, turns out they're really good once you actually gave them a chance to play it. The way their mind works, they actually play it really well. But this guy over here who really loves Star Wars and really nerds out about it, he thinks he's supposed to be like the best at it because he really loves Star Wars ever since he was a kid, whereas this person who doesn't hate Star Wars but doesn't, love it and nerd out on it, they just, logistically and objectively, just technically just liked playing that game, that strategy game. They just liked the technicality of it or whatever, of doing it, but it wasn't really because of Star Wars, the property. It was just the game itself interested them. So, it's quite funny, the ownership that people feel that they have and stuff, and also when you're a kid, though, it's also a bit excused, because you're a kid, whereas when you're an adult, when you're doing that, it's like, hang on, mate, grow up. Like, doesn't mean you can't be interested in that thing anymore or something. It's just, you don't get to gatekeep it. Everyone can be allowed to be into a thing, and just be content with knowing that, you know what I mean? It's like how that you're into it to the level that you're into it, and and enjoy that for itself. You don't need to prove anything to other people about it, but it's this weird, like, having to prove to other people or impact other people. It's quite a funny little conceit. That's probably one of my, like, experiences. Not that with that. Like, not that I can think too greatly of ever of that, because I'm not trying to be humble or sort of act like I'm perfect, but I was never really that sort of person who tried to fan ownership or gatekeep over media, things like that. I enjoyed, as I said, because I have the example of that person with Final Fantasy that was playing it way more than me back then, and when I met them and they owned a bunch more of the games than I did. I think I literally owned one of them, and like the one that I really liked the most, which is probably I would argue was the best one, Final Fantasy 7. And I just enjoyed that they enjoyed it, and sort of, wow, they can teach me what else can I find out about it and stuff and yada yada. And I just enjoyed that there was someone. I enjoyed that I found someone else who enjoyed it, So yeah, like it wasn't like I would say that it wasn't like I was guilty of that behaviour of trying to shut other people down or sort of no, you couldn't have done that well at it, But in terms of my encountering of people that did, it was like one of my mates who was like that, Not that it's exactly the same thing, but I'm now randomly thinking of there was a kid when I went to primary school, because as I said, when I went to intermediate, that was that's 2 years of school, and it was 2001 and 2002. So that was another interesting thing with like my years at not primary school necessarily, but like intermediate and high school, was the because in New Zealand as well, they would classify like the years of school that you're in by two different how do I put it, like the way there's like imperial and metric. They would have sort of two different grading things for that. Well, not grades, like whether you're doing good or bad, but just, what year you're in. Like one thing would be actually year whatever, and the other thing would be the form. So there would be like, like the first year of intermediate, which was, for me, was in the year 2001. That was year... What was it? Year 7. They would call that year 7 of, because it's like year 7 of school. I think just the overall like years of you being at school, like any school. So like you do X amount of years at primary, and then there's like that's year 7 or something essentially. Something akin, I think it's sort of akin to that, or whether education, or sort of thing. I think is what it's meant to be. And so year 7 of intermediate, the first year of intermediate is year 7, but it's also known as Form 1 or first form. Form 1, Form 2, Form 3, so on. But, Form 1 and Form 2 are intermediate. And then in New Zealand, the first year of high school is third form, aka year 9. And so the forms, that system of measurement or grade, that side of the thing, lined up with whatever year that I was, whatever the actual calendar year was. So Form 1 was 2001, Form 1 was 2002, and so on and so forth, And so, where was I going with that? In the last year of primary school, that was the year 2000 for me. And so that was like peak, I'm talking peak level Pokemon craziness. Like right at the end of the 90s, in the year 2000, it was like Pokemon was at the height of Pokemon. And it's carried on with fandom ever since, but it's like it receded into the sort of, the sort of the people that were always going to be into it. Like regardless of whatever the years, like the way you get people that are into like jazz or something, like, and it's sort of, they could have been into it in the 50s and something or whatever, back when jazz was sort of at its biggest or something, but then even in the 80s, 90s, today, whatever, kind of thing, they're still into, that's a person who's still into it because they're just, or maybe they picked it up later, they weren't into it back then because they were too young or they weren't born yet, but they're into it now. But it's not like everyone else is into it, whereas back in that sort of turning of the millennium, it was at that sort of peak thing where there were a lot of people that were probably not always forever going to be into it. That was it was one of those sort of pop culture things that a lot of just was around of interest for kids at that time, so it's not like every single kid was into it, but of that age, but they're sort of 11 years oldish and a little bit younger, but it was sort of probably at that peak moment where it was picking up people into its audience that weren't always going to follow it, but then there were people that were always going to follow it, that, you know, as it went on, after years later, it sort of receded and wasn't as big of an audience, but still obviously popular enough to make more movies and games and things, but it found like a core audience, or it just receded back to a core audience, you know. And so with how do I put it? You know, like with Pokemon, I had a friend who, with the cards, with Pokemon cards, because especially at that time as well, that's when the Pokemon cards were sort of especially a part of that craze at their sort of height, and they've sort of carried on still. But as I say, they were sort of at that peak thing where there were a lot of kids playing Pokemon cards that might not otherwise, you know, they'll give up on it and then move on, and then you get the people that are still into it and carry on with it, or, you know, other kids who pick it up later on, but they're having to sort of find that interest themselves. You know, that's their Final Fantasy. They might not know many people, like, you know, like in the year 2010, there were probably a lot more kids who were like, you know, trying to be like, oh, I like Pokemon cards, but no one that I know is really into them. Whereas in the year, like, sort of, you know, the late 90s and the sort of year 2000, when I go to primary school, there were so many kids there with Pokemon cards. You know, they'd go there with like a 2-litre ice cream tub, you know, you get from like the supermarket. They'd have one of those, like, you know, obviously emptied. It wouldn't actually have ice cream in it. That'd be weird if they're bringing 2 litres of ice cream to school. It's like, mate, that's a bit unhealthy. Your mum gave you that for lunch. And they're probably, you know, to each their own. So, you know, but it's like, it's probably not good for them. You know, go there with the ice cream, 2-litre ice cream tub container, just, you know, with all their Pokemon cards in it, you know, sort of thing, if they have tons of them. And so they would, yeah, they would, you know, it was just of this huge interest. And I had a friend who, with Pokemon cards, he would never, it doesn't matter what you traded, he would never trade a card unless you were giving him 2 cards. So if he was trading a card that was, because I think there was also with Pokemon cards, there was like 3, what's the word I'm looking for, like categories or statuses or whatever you want to call them, of like the, how do I explain it, you know, how rare or uncommon or whatever they were. And I think they were literally that. There was like common, uncommon, rare, something like that they were called. And I forget what all the symbols were, but I think maybe one was a circle, one was a square, and one was a triangle, something like that. Well, one was a star, I think, actually, you know, that star I think was a rare one. But, you know, there was like a 3-tier thing of like what the odds of getting that card were, basically, you know, effectively, like how common or uncommon it was. And I think that's literally what 2 of the categories were. Like common was the, you know, the most populous, uncommon was sort of in the middle, and then rare was the, you know, and different cards would have, you know, different ones of those on it, you know. So something like, you know, Zapdos or something, the electric sort of mythical bird, that would be a rare card. Or Mewtwo, the psychic clone Pokemon or whatever, he would be rare. You know, different cards were different things. But then one of the real basic, like, insect bug type Pokemon would be common, you know, just because of its, they're so, you would also encounter that card so much. And my friend Daniel, he would always be so, like, you could be trading a rare card of yours for a rare card of his, and it would just be like, nah, you've also got to give me something else. And it wouldn't be like he wants 2 rare cards for one of his rare cards. It would literally be like, oh, you're trading a rare card for his rare card, but he would also just want like a common card. You know, he would just want something, you know, else. You know, like just I have to have a second thing. I have to be getting something, because in his head he wasn't like winning in the deal, and it wasn't about necessarily that, you know, when you trade Pokemon cards it's about winning or losing, but in his head he seemed to view it that way, where it was like he had to kind of not really be doing better than you in the deal, because he wasn't really. It's like you're trading a rare card for a rare card, but he sort of had, it's like, I had to be getting 2 cards. It felt like he had to be doing better, but you obviously in your own head aren't going to trade, you know, you're not going to, don't want to do yourself an unfair deal, so you're only going to trade up a card if you feel it's worthwhile getting rid of it, you know, for something that you then in return want. But, you know, then there's this thing of like, okay, well, I'm happy to get rid of this card and trade it up if it's for something of like, if it's for that card as an example. I don't want to just trade it up for anything, because that'd be silly. But, you know, if I'm trading it up for this other rare card, hey, I want to add that rare card to my Pokemon deck. But when I'm trading with this kid Daniel, I'm just talking about an outsider person, I've also got to trade up like just another random cheap little card that I have to throw into the deal because he just wants that, and I'm like, okay, well I want that rare card that he's got, but he then whatever, as part of it to make the deal go through, he wants that, and it was just always quite funny. The sort of he'd just be weird about that. No one else I knew would sort of be like that. Anyone else would just be happy to be like, trade one card for one card if it was worthwhile, as long as it was worth it, kind of thing. But to him, it was like, no, you have to trade something else, super common thing, something, and it wouldn't always be that because you didn't want to just have it always necessarily get a card that he already had as well, but it was just, something that like, it had to have something, it had to feel like I'm getting better in the deal, and he wasn't really, because it was the second card was something super common or whatever. It wasn't, like you're trading 2 rare cards for 1 rare card, and you're like, oh, I'm kind of getting screwed over here. It was just, he had to psychologically just feel like he's better in the deal. It's just, weird little sort of, how pop culture and, how people how kids socialize with stuff, whether it's like, action figures or marbles or Pokemon cards or just even their sort of, and just socially just talking about something and how they just psychologically feel like where they, there's a status leaderboard or something of, I know this about, I'm the biggest fan of Star Wars. You're not a bigger fan of Star Wars than me, and I get to, when something goes on with Star Wars in our social group, I should be the one connected to it or something, It's like kids being like I should get to dress up as, Bill Murray in Ghostbusters or something for Halloween. It's that sort of thing. And like, no, you should be whoever, you should be Venkman. So, you know what I mean? Who is Venkman, actually? That might have been Bill Murray. You know what I'm saying? Like, I should be the lead guy. I should be the red Power Ranger, And you should be the yellow one or the blue one, there's the kid who's like thinks they're the biggest Power Ranger fan. Is like, I'm the red one or something, or like I'm the white one. And then there's like that kid who's like wants to be the red one, but like sort of acquiesces, and they're the beta, and they go, I'll be the blue one, because they know they're like, Aaron always sort of like makes an issue out of like if he doesn't get to be the red one, then he sort of like spazzes out and doesn't want to play Power Rangers and ruins it for everyone else. So he has to be the red one, but then I'll be the blue one because that's the next most one, but I really know I'm comfortable being the blue one, so because ultimately no, I can still kick the red one's ass. And the red one just has to feel like he's important, or something. You know what I mean? Like, it's that kind of thing. Yeah. I feel like as well, it's also different generations of stuff, but I don't really follow, obviously follow stuff like that in, of that age bracket, like in the same way. Where it could be that I follow certain things that maybe kids of that age are into, like, because they're things that I might more generally, because they're things I tend to still follow from a younger age, like Star Wars movies, or even Marvel movies as well. But like the first, I guess superhero movies have been coming out since before I was born. But like the first MCU, the Marvel Cinematic Universe movies, the first one of those came out when I was 19. So they started, that was when Iron Man 1 came out. And so the first one of those came out, when I was already like, at the end of my childhood, I'm now a year into being an adult, effectively. And you're still, when you're 19, you're still like a kid up here kind of thing, but you're an adult. You've got all the adult responsibilities and everything in terms of what you can do and, how you're learning to navigate the world and what it's kind of, but you've only got, your year one, kind of thing up here in terms of adult kind of thing. And so, yeah, it's like you sort of peak. It's like you train up to be in terms of being a child, and you learn adult stuff and that. But then it's like, boom, now you're actually like how adults behave, but you're watching it as an audience member. And then it's like, well, now you're actually being an adult, and then you sort of this awareness of adult stuff that you have. You're now trying to put that into effect and see how that goes, how the failure and success rate of that goes in the world. And so, when the MCU started, it was like I was an adult, but there's always been superhero movies coming out. Like, I was 13, I think, when the first Tobey Maguire Spider-Man movie came out. And then, which would have been 2002, second year of intermediate. And so, like there's things like that I've followed, since then, like Star Wars and that, for example, and kids of today can still be into it, but I'm not into the things that, starting that they're into, like that are only for a young age, and then they might continue on and grow. Like Star Wars was something different, where it was kind of for people of all ages, kids and adults and everyone. Whereas, there are things that, like, that might evolve, and they sort of start off as maybe being a kids thing, or then they sort of, as the years go on, the franchise evolves because the fans get older, so they start making it for a sort of a slightly older audience, being more inclusive as opposed to just being a kids thing. It becomes like a Star Wars where it includes young and old people and, stuff like that. Or they make a version of it that's a darker adult version, like 21 Jump Street as an example, the TV show, where that was sort of something that wasn't really designed for like adults, but it wasn't designed for like young kids, but it was sort of something that kids could watch and everything, and it had a very tween teen audience to it at its core, in terms of what, the kind of where the popularity, the sort of mass popularity of it was coming from. But then, years and years later, they did those Jonah Hill, Channing Tatum action comedy movies of 21 and 22 Jump Street, and it's like, well, how do I explain it? Like, they clearly updated it because they were like, well, the original fans of that would be much older now, so they're not coming at it in the same exact. The fans from back then aren't coming at it in the same exact way, and so how do we want to do it? Because the way that they were fanning out on it was a very age-specific thing. Whereas Star Wars is something that's, when you fan out on it, it's kind of a universal thing. It's not something that you can only, you know what I mean, that you would only fan out on it. It's like Justin Bieber, it was sort of like that, we're like, really, like, his fans were people that, like, 13, 14, 15-year-old girls, who kind of fan out on him. And then, like, when those girls get to, like, 30, they might listen to his song or two or something, whatever of his, if they still do, you know what I mean, even if they did, but, like, they're not sort of fanning out in the same way as they did back then, because they've sort of grown and moved on and yada yada. So it's a different a different sort of appreciation or just enjoyment or whatever you want to call it. And that's sort of what 21 Jump Street sort of did. It changed. It sort of went away, and then when they brought it back, it's like, okay, well, the original fans aren't going to be fanning out on it in the same way. It hasn't maintained that fandom, that sort of tween teen fandom. So it's not like it's still been throughout the years. They brought in other people to be like the Johnny Depp heartthrob or whatever, kind of thing, and they've maintained that throughout the decades, and it's still this teen tween, pretty boy thing. It's different now, so they can reassess what they want it to be. And so, you see things like that, but then sometimes you see things that sort of come and go, and then they still sort of seem to be able to stick to what, they're trying to please the same kind of age of fans. Like Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, it's like that's been something that I feel like had a huge fandom back in the day when I was a kid, of a certain, of kids and everything being into it. And it wasn't that only kids could be into it, but it was sort of definitely aimed at that, and probably the big part of it was kids. In terms of the movies and everything, and then the cartoon series. But not that they were the only people into it, but it was definitely probably where the aim was. Oi! Get... Little asshole cat. And so it's not like it ever needed to, it's weird that like it maintained Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. It didn't really maintain its original audience, because I feel like that audience just disappeared. Like they moved on and went to other things. Although some of them might have still been interested in it, but it's not like it's a huge, like, yeah, I've been into Star Wars ever since 1977, and and there's this huge contingent of people like that, who are still into it. And they have opinions about Star Wars things ever since, but they've been a fan of it ever since, and they still want it to be. It's like, I feel like Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles almost keeps trying to restart the same age of fandom. So it's interesting how, I don't know, fandom's an interesting thing with, with pop culture. But I feel like, ultimately just enjoy stuff, It doesn't mean that you can't have negative opinions or anything. Because I hate when people say that, what I was just saying there, like people start doing that, oh, why don't you just don't enjoy stuff? And it's like someone trying to shoot down someone having a negative opinion about something. It's like, you're allowed to criticise stuff, but just don't think that you get to, like, own it. You know what I mean? But a part of that, though, of, that people can say that, though, what I'm saying right there, of like, oh, you don't, you don't get to own it, is like, well, you can be critical about the material if you think it's sort of veering off from what it was, or you don't like the direction it's going in. You're allowed to, criticize it. Just, I mean, like, in terms of when you socially interact with other people, like, just in life, don't think that you get more of a fan than them, I suppose, but in some ways I suppose you do, but, like, not in the sense of, you don't get to sort of control it, unless you're actually making it, you don't get to control it, but you're all allowed to state your opinions about it. But it's all right and wrong, but I feel like it's just a weird insecurity thing. I don't know. It's interesting, because the fandom actually expressing their views is sort of what actually keeps something alive as well. So those opinions do matter. Everyone's opinion matters, but don't think your opinion matters more than other people, perhaps, I think maybe is what I'm trying to say, because if 99 people in a room out of 100 are saying that they want to see this product do this thing, it's like, well, hey, 99% of the people in that room are saying they want it to be that thing, maybe they're right, oh no, but I think that it should be this other thing. It's like, yeah, but it's only you saying that. If that's the kind of Star Wars that you like, that's awesome, but it doesn't seem to be that, like, that's what the audience of today wants. As long as that's what the actual audience does want, it's not, I'm talking about the audience, not like just political studio head, whatever, people marketing stuff, where they're like, oh, we want to make stuff for a woke audience, and then it doesn't make money, and it's like, well, clearly there wasn't actually an audience there that wanted to see that. You were trying to act as if there was, and then cater to something that didn't really exist. Ultimately, you should be just trying to tell good stories, and being aware of the audience, for a pre-existing product, is all you can really do in terms of, because you've established a brand. That's all it really is, just tell good stories and do what you want. But, when you create a brand, like a franchise, once you have a franchise as well, franchise simultaneously is the Star Wars prequel trilogy, is that those movies made an insane amount of money. All three of them. It's not like the first one did and then it dropped off because people realised what it was and then that's it, it sucked, and then the second and third one made nothing. All three prequel trilogy movies made a ton of money because people obviously liked what the prequel trilogy was doing. But the thing is, there are some people that didn't, because to them Star Wars was X, Y and Z. In terms of the alphabet, it was like, that's what it was. It was doing, it was, well, you know what I mean? It was doing A, C, D, X, Y, and Z. It had to do those things, kind of thing. Whereas with the prequel trilogy, it did A, F, G, T, U, and V. It did other things. It hit other notes, is what I'm trying to say, like other musical notes. And so it's not like it can't do those things and not be Star Wars, but it's a different thing now, whereas originally Star Wars was like, yeah, this is what Star Wars is it does A, C, D, X, Y, and Z. It hits those musical notes, or it hits those numbers, those beats. There's a Death Star that gets blown up, and there's this and that, the other, and that's what makes a Star Wars film a Star Wars film. Because there was also only 3 of them prior to the prequel trilogy. Whereas once the once the prequel trilogy came along, it was like they were Star Wars films that were doing other things. They weren't trying to hit the exact same beats as the original trilogy movies were doing. But then when the Disney sequel trilogy came along, they were trying to hit similar, especially The Force Awakens, it was hitting a lot of similar beats that the original trilogy films had done. And people liked the nostalgia of that. And I did too. But it's just like that was sort of, I feel like people didn't point at that. I don't feel like people sort of pointed that out quite exactly. That it was this evolving thing of like, hey, Star Wars is kind of becoming, it sort of already was becoming other things, even under George Lucas with the prequel trilogy. But that was all he then ever did, was the prequel trilogy afterwards. So he only made 6 films. And so there was this disparate difference of, there's the original trilogy and what Star Wars is, you know, versus these prequel trilogy films, you know, they're bloody trying to ruin it, you know what I mean, that sort of thing. There was that old and new divide there. And then what's happened with the Disney, one thing that's happened with Disney taking over of Star Wars is that they now have opened up Star Wars into being able to be a product that can hit multiple different notes. Like Rogue One is yet another different kind of thing. It hits other notes, hits other different beats of the drum than the original trilogy or even the prequel trilogy, you know. So it's becoming, and then there's TV shows of Star Wars that are, you know, live action TV shows. So it doesn't have to be this hyper specific thing now. It can be something. It can be Star Wars. You know, there's still something about it has to be a certain thing in order to be Star Wars, but the realization that that's actually a much wider, you know, much wider sort of what's the word I'm looking for, bracket that things can fit within than people originally really gave it credit for or allowed it to be. You know, that, hey, you know, like, it doesn't just have to be people blowing up a Death Star. It doesn't just have to be Luke Skywalker. It doesn't just have to be, you know what I mean, certain things. So it's yeah, but it still has to be a certain thing, obviously, for it to be Star Wars. Because then, if you change too much, then it's not Star Wars at all. But there's a certain amount that it has to adhere to. But there was a lot of rigidity, I think, that people were sort of like, no, that's Star Wars, and it's these very specific notes that they will say that it has to hit all these different particular notes, and that's Star Wars. And it's like, yeah, but it doesn't always have to hit those notes or those certain beats of, you know, do these certain things. The prequel trilogy didn't do those, and that's George Lucas who made those. He made Star Wars, so even he made Star Wars films and products and that weren't doing the exact same things the original trilogy did. So that's only continuing on. You know, so as time goes on, you get to see, I think, the awareness of Star Wars, and people have allowed other franchises to be like that, and there's something about Star Wars with that fan ownership where people just wouldn't, you know, allow it to, you know, didn't want to allow it to be anything more than what they wanted it to be, because they felt like they knew best. And it's like, it's great that you love it and that you love the things about Star Wars that you love, but other things are going to pop up in Star Wars, and they're only going to live or die by other people loving, you know, by, if you don't like them, that's cool, that's awesome, and you're allowed to criticize them. But those other things are also going to only live, they're only going to become successful, because that's sort of what I think they hate, is the, I don't want that thing to take over what Star Wars is. It's like, yeah, well, if people actually don't like it, you know, if that's the case, if it's not good, then it won't, you know, ultimately do well or carry on in our memories or anything, or just in the franchise. You know, so because people didn't love it the way that you and a lot of other people loved the original trilogy and the other films and products and Star Wars or whatever the franchise is. So you love and continue to love and add energy and support towards the things in that franchise, that whether it's Star Wars or Harry Potter or Star Trek or Lord of the Rings or whatever, add the energy and love to the things that you do, you know, like, and you're allowed to be critical, obviously, of the things that you don't, but just be content and aware, and you know, just be self-aware that those things that you supposedly don't like, or not supposedly, saying that you're lying about not liking them, the things that come along into a franchise that, you know, you don't like, be just self-aware and content in the information that they're not going to do well if they actually aren't good anyway, because they don't have people like you adding the love that you have for the products that you do like to them, you know, because they're not being memorable or amazing in their storytelling or whatever, the way that the things that you do like in it are, you know. Like, yeah, the first 3 movies are great and the other ones are great, but like there's new things are shit. It's like, yeah, but there's a lot of other people out there who they might even go see it at the movies. So even if it made a lot of money at the movies though, it's like, yeah, but then it just gets forgotten, you know. There are a lot of movies that people go see at the movies and then they just get forgotten because they're just a movie. They're just, as I said about people, there are people that just like to go see, just a fun movie or just something, just some colours and some flashes and booms and bangs or whatever that happen on the screen. You know, like look at those Transformers movies that happened back in the day, the Michael Bay ones. There's a lot, he did like 5 of those films. There's still more Transformers films coming. But most of those ones didn't even, you know, people don't remember. There's 3 Shia LaBeouf ones. They're probably the most memorable. But even out of the ones he did, you know, they're not all memorable. Like, it's only really probably the first one that's like the most amazing. The great one. You know, but yet they all made insane amounts of money. You know, so because they were at least of interest enough to people to go and just watch it because it was going to be entertaining. You know, but it doesn't mean that they consider it like, oh, we love it, and you know, we keep adding energy to it, and we love original trilogy Star Wars. It's not like that for them. It's just something that they went and saw at the movies, and then they move on with their life. And there's a lot of products that come out like that nowadays, like especially in the Marvel universe, of the cinematic universe, where lots of people went and saw Captain Marvel at the movies. I actually saw it like 3 times at the movies because there was a lot of stuff in it that I sort of liked, and I was just wanting to see a Marvel movie at the movies because I was waiting for the next Avengers movie to basically come along, which is only like a month away, so I was just digging to just see a Marvel movie, you know. But there was the Samuel L. Jackson of it, there was the 90s nostalgia of it, there was the, funny enough, there was the cat, Goose the cat, you know, there was there was the shape-shifting alien done by the Australian actor Ben Mendelsohn, you know, there was lots of different things in that movie, but not that I hate it, but you know, there was, I wasn't like, oh, Brie Larson, wow, amazing, all da-di-da, you know, it wasn't like that was some memorable thing for me. So I went and saw the movie, and then that was it done, you know. And then we move on, and now no one goes, oh yeah, Captain Marvel, da-di-da, like no one talks about Captain Marvel, the movie, the way people talked about Iron Man, the movie, which struck a certain chord, you know, so, and I'm not saying people aren't allowed to be into Captain Marvel, it's just it didn't seem to strike a chord with people, you know, the way that Iron Man 1 clearly did, you know, that movie will get remembered, and it still does, you know, it's like we're, how many years now? Is it like 15 years later? Yeah. You go ahead 5 years from Iron Man 1, that's 2013. Funny enough, that's the year Iron Man 3 came out. The last time an actual Iron Man film came out. Then you go ahead another 10 years now to 2023. So 15 years ago, the MCU started. And so, you know, like, that's where it started though. That movie's like memorable for people. And it doesn't mean that everything from back then is either. Like, no one tends to remember or go on about the Incredible Hulk movie with Edward Norton. No one ever really tends to go on about Iron Man 2, you know. It's not often you hear people go on about Captain America, the first Avenger, or even the first Thor movie. Not that people absolutely hate those movies necessarily, but just they're not remembered. And they're not you know, the way that, like, Iron Man 1 or, like, you know, the original Star Wars or something, or, you know, the original Guardians of the Galaxy. These are movies that are, like, have become memorable, you know, and carry on, you know, beyond their just life at the cinema. And so they're going to do that regardless, you know, because the love pours out to them of that being a good thing that people connect with. And it's like the people that are like that thing get scared that another thing is going to come along and enter that franchise and sort of take over. It's like, yeah, well, it can't if it's actually shit. If you're aware that it's shit, which it actually is, it's not going to actually take over. It can't actually take over, mate, because it doesn't have the love and the memorability that thing does, you know. But that the good parts of it have, you know, that the Iron Man 1 or the Guardians of the Galaxy 1 or the Star Wars A New Hope, you know, or Empire Strikes Back or whatever, you know, have. So it's you know, fandom's this long and enduring thing, you know, and I feel like people just need to get a little bit more self-awareness about it, you know, in terms of their, like, you know, there's going to be highs and lows, you know, and always be aware that the good things will always be there, you know, and that they can't die, you know, as long as you own physical media as well, because don't put all your stock into all your versions of something being on a streaming service, because as we've seen, they'll start editing and redoing things in the streaming versions of movies. So you don't want, if you want to get the original thing, buy it on DVD or something, or Blu-ray or whatever. Get it, that sort of physical copy of it, because you don't want your version of it, that the only version of something you can watch, to be the 2023 or the 2020 or the whatever version, that's on Disney Plus or something, where they've edited out things, or they've changed it so heavily, because because of the current time. Like, get the version that buy the original, thing. Get the original thing. Doesn't mean that you have to get the original Star Wars. Like, get the special edition, of the original trilogy, the 1997 thing, if you want. But don't it's never going to die, essentially. Like, they can't delete the Lord of the Rings as a book. If they want to try and make woke Amazon TV shows, that's not going to delete the book. There's always the physical book out there, is what I'm trying to say. So, yeah. I wasn't necessarily intending to talk about fans this much, but it sort of started that, didn't it? Got into a little bit of a tangent there, talking about mates from school and their little Star Wars, fan ownership. But that's just another one of Dark's rants. Dark's rants, depending on how your accent would say things. You'd be like, oh, Dark's rants. Dark's rants, but for me it's Dark's rants. So this has been another one of Dark's rants. Well, some point in the near future, we'll, when I feel like it, we'll have another run. But until then, keep on supporting the things you like, keep on criticising the things you don't like, and take it all with a grain of salt. Take it all with a grain of salt.